The glossy windows of the boutique gleamed under the afternoon sun, reflecting the bustling streets of the city. Inside, the soft hum of jazz played in the background, mingling with the delicate scent of expensive perfume and freshly polished leather. The boutique was an oasis of luxury, a space where only those with the finest tastes and the deepest pockets could afford to step inside. It was the kind of place that many people dreamed of visiting but never truly believed they could belong to. The racks were adorned with garments from high-end designers, and the shelves were stocked with the most exquisite accessories. Everything in this store screamed exclusivity, from the gleaming display cases filled with diamond watches to the handcrafted shoes that could cost as much as a month's rent. Charles entered the boutique with the calm confidence of a man who had never been concerned with the price tags on anything. He was tall, dressed in a well-tailored suit that fit him like it had been made just for him. His presence was magnetic, the kind of person who didn't need to announce his importance, it was already known. Yet, he wasn't the type to draw attention to himself. He moved through the store with a quiet grace, like he was simply a part of the space, as if he belonged here as much as the sparkling jewels and fine leather handbags. As he passed through the aisles, he caught the eye of the boutique manager, a man named Daniel. Daniel was in his mid-40s, impeccably groomed, with a look that screamed superiority. He was used to people like Charles, the type who could afford the high-end prices, the type who didn't ask questions when it came to luxury. But as he watched Charles move through the store, something caught his attention, something in the way the man carried himself, something that made Daniel pause. It was at that moment that his assumptions began to form. Daniel had seen many people walk through the doors of his boutique. He had seen the wealthy, the famous, and the glamorous, but there was something different about Charles. He didn't have the aura of a typical customer. His clothes were well made, yes, but they weren't the latest season's designer pieces, and his shoes, while expensive, weren't the ones Daniel would have expected someone like him to wear. The manager's mind began to work overtime. Perhaps this man wasn't here to buy. Perhaps he was just window shopping, someone trying to experience a taste of the high life without actually being able to afford it. Daniel had seen it before, people coming into the store, acting as though they were wealthy, trying to look the part. It was something he found both amusing and frustrating. He wasn't sure yet, but he was certain Charles didn't belong in his store. As Charles stopped in front of a display case containing a rare collection of watches, Daniel saw an opportunity. He approached with a practiced smile, ready to assess this man's true intentions. "Good afternoon, sir," Daniel said, his voice smooth and professional. "Can I help you with something today?" Charles turned toward him with a calm, almost unreadable expression. He seemed to take in the boutique and the manager with a single glance, then nodded. "Yes, I'm looking for a gift," he said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Ah, a gift," Daniel replied, his tone tightening slightly. "We have a wonderful selection of luxury accessories, watches, ties, cufflinks, perhaps something a bit more refined?" Charles raised an eyebrow slightly. "I'm looking for something unique," he said, his gaze still steady, something more than just a simple gift. Daniel couldn't help but feel a slight discomfort in Charles's gaze. There was something about the way he spoke, something that didn't quite match the typical profile of a customer in his boutique. Daniel didn't like it. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a feeling of unease creeping up his spine. Charles turned his attention back to the display case, examining a watch carefully. "This one looks interesting," he said, his finger lightly tracing the glass. "How much is it?" Daniel stepped closer, eager to make a sale, but his mind was still preoccupied with the doubt that lingered in the back of his mind. "That particular piece is $20,000, he said, his voice oozing with a touch of pride. "It's one of our most exclusive pieces." Charles nodded, but the smile that played at the corners of his lips wasn't one of admiration, it was knowing, as though he already knew what Daniel was thinking. 20,000, Charles repeated, his voice soft, as if savoring the price for a moment. "It's a beautiful watch, but I have to admit, I'm more interested in what else you have here." Daniel blinked, momentarily taken aback by the calmness in Charles's tone. Most customers, when faced with such a high price tag, would hesitate, would ask about discounts, or would start to bargain, but Charles didn't do any of that. He simply moved on, as if the price was of no concern at all. Daniel followed him, still trying to gauge what kind of customer he was dealing with. "We have a wonderful selection of bags," he said, trying to steer Charles toward something more affordable. "And our clothing collection is top-notch. Perhaps you'd like to see our new arrivals?" But Charles wasn't interested. He wasn't looking for just anything. He wasn't here to play the typical game of window shopping and bargaining. He had a different agenda. Actually, Charles said, turning to face Daniel, I'll take the watch, and I'll take a few other things as well. What else do you have in stock? Daniel was stunned. His mind raced to process what was happening. He had expected this man to pick something modest, maybe a scarf, or one of the less expensive items. But instead, Charles had gone straight for the most expensive item in the store, and now he was asking for more. Well, sir, if you're interested in other high-end items, we have some custom-made shoes, and perhaps a selection of... Daniel's words faltered. He was trying to remain professional, but he was struggling to understand what was happening. Something didn't add up. Charles, however, wasn't concerned with the manager's confusion. He had already made his decision. I'll take it all, he said, his tone calm and final. Everything in the store. Charles's words hung in the air like a challenge, daring the boutique manager to question him, to second-guess the authority in his voice. It wasn't just the request, it was the way he carried it out with such effortless confidence, as if the entire boutique were his for the taking. For a brief moment, Daniel stood there, motionless, struggling to process what he had just heard. Take it all? Every single item in the store? The idea of someone buying out the entire boutique, especially someone like Charles, was almost incomprehensible. Daniel had spent years working in luxury retail, managing high-end stores, but he had never once encountered someone who could simply walk in and make such an audacious claim without a hint of hesitation. Sir, if you're serious about this, it will take some time to prepare, Daniel stammered, forcing himself to return to his professional composure. We will need to go over the inventory and arrange everything properly. This kind of purchase usually requires... I'm not interested in any delays, Charles interrupted smoothly, his voice cutting through Daniel's flustered attempts to maintain control of the situation. I want everything packed and sent to my address, right now. The manager swallowed, his face flushing slightly with the weight of his own discomfort. He had misjudged Charles the moment he walked into the store. His assumption had been that a man dressed so casually, yet exuding an air of quiet authority, couldn't possibly afford to shop here. How wrong he had been. His mind raced, and he scrambled for a response. This wasn't just a sale. It was a moment that could either elevate him or make him look like a fool. He needed to play it carefully. He needed to get the transaction moving, and fast, before anyone else in the store noticed. Of course, sir, I'll call the back office to start preparing the items for you, Daniel said, his voice strained but polite. Do you have a preferred method of payment? Charles's lips curled into a slight, enigmatic smile. I'll handle the payment. You don't need to worry about that. His eyes never wavered from Daniel's, making the manager feel more and more like a child caught in a lie. As Daniel hurried to the back office to arrange the purchase, he couldn't shake the feeling of embarrassment creeping over him. He had tried to play the role of the aloof boutique manager, expecting Charles to buckle under the pressure of high-end prices and his pointed assumptions. But instead, Charles had completely flipped the script. Back in the store, the employees were starting to murmur amongst themselves. A few had noticed the exchange between the manager and Charles. Their curiosity piqued. The boutique was usually reserved for the city's most elite, and someone walking in and buying the entire store was unheard of. One of the junior sales associates, a young woman who had been quietly folding clothes in the corner, approached Charles hesitantly. She had witnessed the interaction from the sidelines and couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and confusion. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is everything all right? Do you need help with anything else?" Charles turned to face her, his expression softening slightly, though his authority remained intact. "No, thank you," he said, his tone warm but firm. "I'm all set." The sales associate hesitated, a flicker of something in her eyes, curiosity, maybe even disbelief. She had seen customers come and go, many of them wealthy, many of them accustomed to the luxury the store provided. But this man was different. There was a quiet power in him, a calmness that made it clear he wasn't someone to be dismissed or underestimated. As Daniel returned, phone pressed to his ear, he had already begun to process the situation. The back office was pulling together the items Charles had requested. The bags were being prepared, the clothing folded with meticulous care. But even with all the logistics in motion, Daniel couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. Something was about to change. He could feel it. This wasn't just another sale, it was an event. And somehow, he knew that this moment would leave a lasting impact on both him and the store he had worked so hard to build. As the bags were packed and prepared for shipment, Charles surveyed the boutique one last time. His gaze swept over the elegant displays, the gleaming countertops, the pristine shelves filled with luxury. For a moment, he allowed himself a small smile. He wasn't doing this for the goods. No, it was something far more significant. He was making a statement to the manager and to anyone else who believed that wealth, status, or appearance determined who belonged where. When the final bag was handed to him, Charles didn't rush. He took his time, moving with deliberate grace, as if savoring the weight of the moment. He had come into this boutique a man determined to show that he wasn't just a customer, he was someone who could shift the power dynamics with a simple action. Before leaving, Charles turned to Daniel, who was still trying to process everything, his face now pale and his voice barely a whisper. "I think you'll remember me," Charles said with a knowing look, "and I hope this helps you understand that no one has the right to decide who belongs here." With that, he walked out of the boutique, the door chiming softly as it closed behind him. Daniel stood frozen in place, his mind still reeling. The other employees stood silently as well, unsure of how to react. But as the last echoes of Charles's footsteps faded, something shifted in the room. The manager, who had once held the upper hand, now found himself face to face with the consequences of his own assumptions. And in that moment, Daniel understood something he had never fully appreciated before. There was power in perception, but true power came from knowing who you were and never letting anyone take that away from you. The days following Charles's visit to the boutique were a blur of activity and gossip. Word spread quickly among the staff, and soon, the entire luxury shopping district was buzzing with tales of the man who had come in, bought out the entire store, and walked out as if it were the most ordinary transaction in the world. The boutique's reputation was elevated in a way no one could have anticipated, and the story took on a life of its own, transforming from a mere shopping spree into something of a legend. But while the boutique's sales figures soared, the impact on Daniel was far more complex. His days were filled with phone calls from upper management, emails, and endless meetings. Despite the seemingly profitable outcome of Charles's visit, there was a lingering tension hanging in the air. The head office had caught wind of the incident, and they had questions. They wanted answers. They wanted to understand how this had happened, how the boutique's reputation had been shaken, and why it was that someone who seemed out of place had been treated with such a lack of caution. As the days wore on, Daniel found himself increasingly isolated within the boutique. The staff, once deferential and eager to please him, now regarded him with subtle wariness. There was no outright confrontation, but the whispers behind closed doors were hard to ignore. No one had ever seen a customer purchase everything in the store. No one had ever seen the boutique's authority so thoroughly undermined. One afternoon, Daniel sat alone in his office, staring at the glass doors of the boutique. The room, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage. He had heard nothing from Charles since that fateful day. No phone calls, no messages, no sign of the man who had so easily upended everything Daniel thought he knew about his business. The silence gnawed at him, and the more he thought about it, the more the weight of his earlier decision seemed unbearable. He had made assumptions about Charles, assumptions based on his appearance, his clothing, and his demeanor. He had assumed that someone who didn't fit the mold of a typical customer wouldn't have the means to shop in his boutique. That assumption had cost him more than just a sale. It had cost him his own sense of control. The sound of the boutique door opening pulled Daniel from his thoughts. He glanced up sharply, his heart skipping a beat as he recognized the figure standing in the doorway. It was Charles. He walked in with the same calm, unruffled presence that had defined him during their first encounter. His suit was perfectly tailored, his stride purposeful, and there was an air of authority around him that made the entire boutique seem to shift in response. The staff, who had been chatting among themselves, fell silent as Charles moved through the store, his eyes scanning the displays as though they were all part of a much larger plan. Daniel stood up quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mr. Charles," he said, his voice a bit shakier than he had intended. "What can I?" Charles raised a hand, cutting him off. "No need for pleasantries, Daniel. I've been thinking about our last conversation, about the way you treated me." Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it to be so soon. He had hoped that Charles would fade into the background, a wealthy but fleeting customer who would never cross his path again. But now, standing face to face with him, Daniel realized just how wrong he had been. "I want to make something clear," Charles continued, his voice low but commanding. "You assumed things about me. You judged me based on how I looked, based on the fact that I didn't immediately fit the image of someone who could afford the luxury of your boutique." Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing. He didn't know how to respond. He could feel the weight of Charles's words pressing down on him. but he didn't know how to fix what had already been done. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. "I shouldn't have made assumptions about you. I was wrong." Charles tilted his head slightly, as if considering the sincerity in Daniel's apology. He didn't immediately respond, but his eyes never left Daniel's, as if trying to gauge the depth of his words. After a long pause, Charles spoke again. "I'm not here to have a simple apology. That's not what I'm after." He glanced around the boutique, his eye sweeping over the racks of clothing, the glass shelves filled with high-end accessories. "What I'm here for is something much more significant." Daniel blinked, confused. "I don't understand. What do you mean?" Charles smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had control, someone who knew exactly what was happening. "I want to buy this boutique," he said, his words deliberate and final. "The entire store, the brand, everything. I want to own it." The words hit Daniel like a slap to the face. He had expected many things, perhaps a confrontation, maybe even a demand for a refund. But this was something else entirely. "Excuse me?" Daniel gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You want to buy the store?" "Yes," Charles replied, his tone unyielding. "I'm not just some customer. I have the resources, the connections, and the drive to take this place and make it my own. And I'm going to do just that." Daniel struggled to comprehend what he was hearing. His mind raced as he thought about the ramifications of such a statement. If Charles truly had the power and the intention to buy the boutique, it would be the end of everything Daniel had worked for. The thought of losing his position, his prestige, his very place in the world was more than he could bear. "But why?" Daniel stammered. "Why would you want to do that? What would you gain from something like this?" Charles looked at him, his gaze unwavering. "Because I can. Because I'm not going to let people like you judge me again. I'll turn the tables. I'll show you what it means to underestimate someone." And with that, Charles turned on his heel, walking out of the boutique without another word. The sound of the door closing behind him felt like the final nail in the coffin. Daniel stood frozen for a long moment, the weight of Charles's words settling in his chest. Everything had changed, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The days after Charles's visit passed in a haze of uncertainty and dread. Daniel had been left to stew in his own regrets, the weight of his actions and decisions pressing heavily on his shoulders. The boutique, which once felt like a fortress of prestige and luxury, now felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest tremor. The corporate office had taken Charles's proposal seriously, too seriously. Daniel had been summoned to meetings where higher-ups grilled him about the incident. They demanded answers he didn't have, and they expressed concerns about the optics, what it would mean for the store's reputation if a man like Charles could waltz in, make demands, and leave with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. As the days wore on, the phone calls grew more frequent, and the pressure mounted. Daniel's once pristine reputation was now in tatters, and all his efforts to downplay the situation had only served to make it worse. He began to wonder if he would even keep his job, or if his future in luxury retail had been destroyed in one fell swoop. But what stung the most wasn't the threat to his career, it was the sense of humiliation that he couldn't shake. He had been so sure of himself, so certain of his control over the situation. He had believed that his role as manager of such a prestigious boutique meant he held power, and yet Charles had shattered that illusion with a single sentence. That night, Daniel sat in his office, staring at the glowing screen of his computer. He hadn't been able to concentrate on work for days. His mind kept drifting back to Charles, to that unnerving calm in his eyes, and the cool, calculated way he had walked in and made his demands. It wasn't just a purchase, it was a statement Daniel could feel burning into him, a reminder of his own inadequacy. Suddenly, the door to his office swung open, and a voice broke through his thoughts. "Daniel?" It was Clara, one of the senior sales associates. She stepped inside, her posture stiff, as though unsure whether she should be there. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. Daniel looked up, blinking, as if seeing her for the first time. "Clara, what's going on?" "I've been thinking about what happened," Clara began, her voice hesitant but determined, "about how you treated Charles, and about the way you've been acting since then." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean? What do you think I should have done?" Clara's eyes softened, but there was a sharpness to her tone that cut through the air. "You didn't just treat Charles like a customer. You treated him like he didn't belong here, like he was beneath you. And that's not just about him, it's about everyone. People like him, people who don't fit your idea of what a real customer looks like. People like me," she added, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel froze, the words hitting him harder than he had expected. He had always seen himself as a professional, someone who upheld the standards of the boutique, but in that moment, he realized that his treatment of Charles had been more than a lapse in judgment, it had been a reflection of his own prejudices. He had assumed that someone who didn't meet the typical mold of the wealthy elite didn't deserve the respect that came with being a customer. Clara continued, her voice steady now. You've got to understand that Charles wasn't just buying things for himself. He was showing you something. He was showing you how wrong you were, and how much power you had given away without even realizing it. And now, the store, the company, everyone's watching you. They want to know how you're going to handle this. Daniel's stomach twisted. He had always thought of himself as a good manager, but now, in the face of Clara's pointed observations, he was beginning to see the cracks in his own self-image. He had been so focused on maintaining control, on keeping the boutique's image pristine, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. He had allowed his own arrogance and assumptions to cloud his judgment. Clara's eyes softened as she spoke again. You need to fix this, Daniel. You need to show everyone that you can learn from this, that you can see beyond the surface, beyond what you think you know, because if you don't, you might just lose everything, and it won't just be your job, it'll be your chance to rebuild your reputation. You have to own up to what happened, and take responsibility for the way you treated Charles. The word stung, but Daniel knew she was right. He had been given a second chance. Whether he could make the most of it or let it slip away was up to him, but he couldn't do it alone. He had to make amends, both with Charles and with himself. The next day, Charles returned to the boutique, but this time, there was no cold arrogance in his demeanor. He walked through the door like a man who was ready to close a deal, not just one who had come to make a statement. Daniel, his nerves taut, approached him immediately. Mr. Charles, I owe you an apology. I didn't treat you with the respect you deserved. I made assumptions based on your appearance, and that was wrong. I let my own biases get in the way of doing my job properly. For that, I am truly sorry. Charles paused for a moment, his eyes studying Daniel closely. There was no sign of anger or resentment, only a quiet understanding. He didn't say anything right away. Instead, he took a seat in one of the plush chairs near the front of the boutique, signaling for Daniel to join him. Tell me, Charles said, his tone thoughtful. Why are you apologizing now? What has changed? Daniel swallowed, gathering his thoughts. I've realized that it wasn't about you. It was about me. I thought I had the right to judge you, to decide who belongs here, based on how you looked. But the truth is, that was never my place. This boutique isn't about me, it's about the customers, and I've learned that the hard way. Charles nodded, a hint of approval in his gaze. Good. It's easy to let the superficial things control your judgment, but the real power lies in being able to see people for who they truly are. Daniel let out a slow breath, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. This was a turning point, a chance to rebuild. He wasn't just apologizing for a single moment in time. He was rebuilding the foundation of who he was and how he would approach his work moving forward. Charles stood up, his decision made. You've learned something valuable today, Daniel, and I'll give you one more piece of advice. Never underestimate anyone again, not even yourself. With those words, Charles turned and walked out of the boutique, leaving Daniel standing there, his heart a little lighter, his mind clearer. The boutique had survived the storm, but Daniel had been changed by it, and with that, he understood something deeper about power, about respect, and about what it truly meant to succeed.